All right, we're live. Welcome everyone to the podcast Dreaming in Symbols. This is episode 6. Dreaming in Symbols is a podcast dedicated to the exploration and studying of comparative religion, psychology, history, mythology, and other related subjects, including the news pertaining to those subjects. While most platforms usually discuss religion from a reductionist perspective, or a dogmatic literalistic perspective, Dreaming in Symbols offers a platform for discussion of a third path or of a different nature, focusing more on the psycho-spiritual, non-dogmatic perspective. The podcast is weekly, and I typically will have special guests, and my guest today is the Path of Abraham, and our topic today is an understanding of the Book of Job. So I guess, Path, I'll let you begin. You mentioned before we went live that you're writing a book on the subject of the Book of Job. So maybe I could ask you if you want to tell the viewers and listeners a little bit about your book thus far.
Yeah, so it's not going to be finished anytime soon, so nobody get their hopes up. Probably like 4 years down the road, but been working on it for a while. It's basically I guess it's kind of like the cliche. It's like, I saw there was a void that needed to be filled, and like somebody's got to do it, so I'll do it. But it's basically it's basically a book where it's a breakdown and explanation of the Book of Job. But why it's I think different is because it's not a running commentary, which is most of the themes that I'm going after and like the tradition I'm following. You only really find these themes in a running commentary, so I'm kind of condensing it into basically a overview and breakdown of the concepts and the implications and maybe the surrounding histories of the Book of Job. So it's not necessarily a commentary on the structure of the text, but it's a commentary on the overall text itself. And I guess the biggest implications is that I think oftentimes the Book of Job is interpreted in a way that's, I think, just disingenuous to the text. And I don't come from a tradition of believing in monolithic views of interpretation. That's up to the individual, and you can't really, it's not dictated by, it's up to the person. So I'm not saying that, but it's more so the idea of like people, I think, have gone to the Book of Job for reasons that aren't really inerrant in the text. So I actually have an example. It's here. So this is a book called The Book of Job, Annotated and Explained by Daniel Krauss. And in his introduction, this is how he describes, he's a secular scholar on it, but in his introduction, he's describing what he sees the Book of Job as, its purpose and its trajectory. And it's, I think, pretty common in the Western world as well. So this is probably, I think, the biggest issue I have with how it's interpreted. So he says, the proud suggests that there may be blips in the system of divine retribution, but a person who is patient will ultimately be rewarded properly in this world. These blips are significant. The theology here is not that the righteous always prosper and the wicked always punished, but that this is ultimately the case. And the exceptions have reasons. God's heavenly court is run better than the human counterpart, but is not run perfectly. And then he goes on to say, no one has yet to succeed but the book, though it is in its engaging style, an important message continues to help generation after generation address the simple question asked by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 12:1, why does the way of the guilty prosper? Job also shows that even though recent times may be the first to have invoked a very large scale of human killings, we must remember that life of every single human individual we have to remember the life of every single human individual, for that is the level on which Job offers its powerful thought and ambiguous message. And basically what it's summing up is a view that the story of Job is structured in a way to answer the question of why do bad things happen to good people. That's like how it's viewed, and it's saying it's a theological text, which I'm coming from a traditionist standpoint where the Book of Job isn't teaching theology, and it's definitely not commenting on the concept of evil. Why does evil happen? That's a non-issue. We kind of boiled down the concept of evil pretty much blatant because it says it in the Torah, the Book of Deuteronomy. It also says it in Jeremiah, and I believe in Ezekiel, that pretty blatant that like God creates evil. So like the concept of like the wrestling with evil, or even like the concept of dualism, wrestling with, well, why is there evil in the world? It's just the way God operates. Just as why there's good in the world, there's evil in the world. So how coming at the text then is from an angle of that I think is pretty unique, is that Job is not necessarily a polemic on evil or suffering, but it is essentially playing out a diatribe that's a commentary on how one acts and the stages one can go through when facing hardship or quote unquote evil in the world. And it's played out and structured in Job, where basically it's a structured story, but it's played out. The characters within the story of Job are aspects of one's psyche, or I guess maybe attach one's attached maybe more so to different understandings of the soul. So basically what you have is you have the character of Job, and it's under the backdrop of this very kind of fantastical story of destruction and hardship. And basically what happens is throughout the narrative is only sandwiched between two chapters, the first chapter and the last chapter. That's what the narrative is. Everything else is just speeches and poems and all this stuff. And so what ends up happening is you have Job afflicted with all these things, and then he's faced with three visitors or three friends. And what I propose through tradition, I can go into that later, is that each three friends is an aspect of one's psyche or one's relationship to God, and or to the divine, I should say. And Job is having to face each one, and that's why there's this back and forth kind of conversation. And the way it's made clear as to like what each three represents is the fact that they're all named, and all their names have meanings. So it's you don't read their name as a name like you would say like for Colin. The name then reads as the title. This is what this aspect of his psyche is representing. So like one of his friends is Eliphaz, and Eliphaz in Hebrew is El is golden. So like God is magnificent in a way. That's what it's saying. So if you read Eliphaz, you're reading a statical monotheistic side. If you read his back and forth on what Eliphaz says, he's taking a very hard stance. He's saying God's always right, there's no wrong kind of thing. You messed up. He's taking a very strict, almost a fundamentalist monotheistic stance. His other friend is I think Bildad, and that's composed of two words. It'd be Bel and Loves, and Bel is a Akkadian god. It's like almost like a generic word for Akkadian deities, but there's ones that are specifically rendered to Bel. Either it's like usually spelled Bel, and so his name's Bel's Loves. So it's representing a fanatical, almost we would say a pagan aspect, but more so philosophically in the sense that it's a much more different view of classical, maybe ethical monotheism. He's taking a very different stance of how one's relationship would be to God, as his other friend Eliphaz, who's obviously representing a more classical, maybe even, like I say, fundamentalist monotheistic tradition. And then the third friend, Sopar, is related to, like, I don't know, there's no word for it in English. It's like a kind of like the sounds like when like birds are chirping in the morning, not like a crow, but like before morning birds start chirping. So it's a teacher of mine says it's symbolic of almost like what we call an atheist now. It's someone who's not taking powers from God per se, and not taking powers from a foreign deity, but someone who on his own is coming to truth. It's like even before the sun comes up, the bird saying morning is coming. So that's what he represents. So you have these three aspects of Job's psyche that he's battling. You have the extreme kind of faithfulness, I guess, devotion. You have the extreme lack of it, and then almost this weird neutral stance. And they kind of play out in the dialogue that go past. And then eventually, those conversations all die out, and like they just kind of like he moves past it. And what then he's faced with is the last friend is Elihu, and Elihu's not even, he just kind of appears. And what's interesting about him is that he's the only one that's given any information about him. Like it gives you his lineage and stuff. So he's more seen as being like he's actually Job realized, because we don't get Job's lineage, but we do at this point. So there's something about when this Elihu character comes in that is almost representative, like this is Job's like realization. And Elihu's name literally means he's God. And why is this symbolic is because the entirety of the book of Job, it's almost like they're just trying to figure out why these things are happening, and trying to understand the mind of God and trying to rationalize all these things. And what Elihu represents, he's like, he's God. He's just pretty much, you just read his speeches, he's just pretty much saying like, there's no point, you don't understand. Like, it's like a mute question. So like, this is reflective of my tradition. This is where my tradition comes from. It's the idea of like trying to say this is a rationalization for the theology of why God creates things like bad or evil in the world is just missing the point. What's more trying to, it's relationship to these tragedies that one cannot rationalize, but because they are done by the creator, how one works through it. And you see that through Job working through the stages of mourning, and almost like a really like an internal monologue is what's happening, almost, but like in a classic Near Eastern and almost Mediterranean diatribe style, where it's back and forth poems. And so like eventually after Job interacts with Elihu, who's also called, he's the youngest, meaning that he came out of these previous experiences. He was the youngest out of them. He was just came out, and he says, I do not know as much as you. I learned from you kind of idea. He's coming from that idea. So then you have finally you have God comes onto the scene, and he's not like the kind of caricature he's presented as in chapter 1 and at the end of the book of Job, where you have this like really kind of a caricature of how God might operate to create the scenario. But the God that ever entered for around in the 40s, that's like it's like the God speaking out of the whirlwind, like this mighty creator God. And it's finally the only point in the book where Job and God interact. Job's moved through all these stages. He's dealt with his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Sopar, and then he's moved on to interacting with Elihu, and now he's moving on to interacting with God himself. But the interaction with God isn't there if you read it. There's no dialogue. Like, Job responds to what God says, but God doesn't really acknowledge anything that Job says before or after. Like, he's just on his own different monologue. And what it's also trying to teach is like Job's honestly trying to have a conversation with God, and God's just being like, I created mountains, I created these things. Where were you at the beginning of creation? They're not like responding to Job at all. He's just saying like, what are you trying to do? Do you not know what I am? And I think that's really trying to speak on the concept of the abstractness of trying to rationalize, we would say, hardship or suffering is irrelevant. What is more important is how one acts in that period of time, and how one grows out of those experiences. Because that's the only thing we can really positive we can get out of it. We can rationalize as much as we want, but we'll never truly know. Like God says, like God finally comes in front of Job, and like this is like never happens really, but like this is the concept. Like God's right there, and Job's just being like, why is this happening? God's just like, I create thunderstorms. It doesn't answer Job, but he's just saying like, what do you mean? Why are you asking me this? Like, this is completely irrelevant. what you're in your situation now. That why is this like a concept in your mind? Like that's not going to fix anything. But through this whole experience, you have Job's kind of rationalization to this, and I can get into maybe explaining why that's a classical position and not just like my own understanding. But it's definitely my own take in the sense that I definitely do view it as like an internal monologue about kind of one's progression through tragedy and suffering.
Well, I think that's fascinating because I think a lot of the discussions that I hear about the Book of Job and the hangups that people have about it are usually individuals who are really trying to wrestle with a metaphysical understanding of it. Trying to understand like, okay, well, there's suffering, and Job is dealt this very bad hand, and he is trying to understand it, and it's a sort of this thing of why Job in particular, when he was such a good servant for God. And I think a lot of people, like, if I'm not mistaken, I think Bart Ehrman in his book God's Problem, I think he might actually talk about the Book of Job, and I think it's sort of an eyesore for a lot of people who are trying to grapple with the question of, if there's this God that is in control of everything, why does he allow suffering to happen? And then when they read the Book of Job, they're thinking, well, look, Job was a nice guy. Why did God put him through all this stuff? So I think it's fascinating to look at it not so much as a question of why do bad things happen to good people, but as you're saying, it's a story that's trying to invoke us dealing with tragedy through these stages. But yeah, I would love it if you. So you just said that it's not just your opinion. You're resting this on some classical scholarship. So please feel free to enlighten us on that.
Okay, so I just took excerpts out of like a lot of introductions to different translations of the Book of Job, and then I'll get into the primary sources just to explain it. So basically, the classical, I don't know if you'd say the classical Jewish stance, I guess you could say that is, nobody believes really that Job is nobody believes that Job is a historical character in the sense that it's written in the Book of Job. Now they could say there's a variety of opinions, and I'm not going to get into them, but it's not like what happens in the Book of Job is a historical account. The way God is described in his counsel isn't how it works. It's a poetical theme, and that's pretty much how the classical opinion is that Job's work of poetry, which I'll maybe comment later, but it's probably the most beautifully written book in the Hebrew Bible as far as Hebrew goes. It's like wonderfully complex, and just like almost the language is just buttery. It's just like it's like better than Psalms in a way. So but what's interesting is that you have in the Babylonian Talmud is I don't have a good translation. I do have a okay translation. Maybe I'll get it later. Is a part of it they start talking about is the sages start going back and forth about different aspects about authorships of the book of the Bible, canonization, co-authorships, and redacting of different books. And one of the things they get into is the Book of Job. And what's very interesting is that you get this, like, I won't get into the whole list, but it's like you have like one sage says this is when the Book of Job takes place, or this is when it was written, this is when it was written, this is when it was written, and like it's like one after another. So it says like right here it says Rabbi Levi ben Nehemiah says Job lived in the time of Moses. Then he gives his proof text for that. 40 years in the wandering in the desert. And then it goes on, it says, Rabbi Hanina says Job lived in the time of the Babylonian exile. And then it goes on and it says, Rabbi Yeshua said Job lived in the days of the Persian exile, the Persian occupation. And then it says, Rav Nisan said that Job was a contemporary with the Queen of Sheba. It's saying like one after another, just different people's opinion of when Job takes place. But what's interesting is that the only affirmative state about the actual authorship is that Moses wrote it. That is the classical consensus from at least from the Babylonian Talmud. It's the only statement that's made about authorship. So not to say it's the only opinion, but it's just the only actual Moses wrote it, and I can get into that. But the idea of having while these rabbis are saying at the time of Enoch, but they also place him during the Babylonian exile. So the whole reason and why they're all stacked together in the Babylonian Talmud like that is to say, like, Job is reflecting on these different periods of time. It's like it's almost saying a way of saying it's timeless. But all those opinions, like I'll get into, I'll show you this source later. But all those opinions end, like the statements, all those statements end with the Talmud coming to not an affirmative conclusion, but it wraps up that different opinions on the dating of Job or the taking place of Job with stating saying most startling view expressed in the Talmud is that Job never was and never existed. He was a parable. Quote, is quoting from the Babylonian Talmud and Bava Batra. This view was immediately rejected on the grounds of detailed accounts of his name and address would be inappropriate, saying like, well, if he's just a parable, why does it tell you where he's from? And why does it tell you about his family? It's like it would seem to be irrelevant. So why would it be a parable? According to Rav Hai Gaon, and he lived like in the 700s and 800s Common Era, quoted by Petach Yitzhak, which is a book, that Rabbi meant that Job existed only for the purpose of being a parable. So one opinion is now saying that he did exist, but his whole purpose of existence was to just be a parable. So trying to merge the idea of like Job is strictly a parable versus Job was a historical person. He's saying like, well, it's both. The only reason he existed was to become a parable. That was his purpose. For people to learn from his book and not despair in times of misfortune, but to hope and trust in the God. He will restore them to greater prosperity and they enjoyed previously. A similar interpretation was given by Smicha Aryeh, another book, an obscure author and of a commentary on the book of Job. The Rambam, who's Maimonides, believes that Job parallels present various beliefs concerning the situation of the enigma of the righteous who suffers and the wicked who enjoys prosperity. According to Rachel, on the book of a book of like a collection of parables on the book of Genesis, at the end of the middle part of Genesis, it says Job did not indeed exist, but his suffering was fictitious. It is related only to tell us that the suffering of those trials and tribulations, he would have been able to bear them. Ibn Ezra, who lived like in the 1200s Common Era, too believed that Job existed, and it evidenced by Ezekiel, because Ezekiel mentions Job as being among the righteous. So he's saying, since Ezekiel mentions him, of course he existed, whereas Job is mentioned together with Noah and Daniel. So you have all like these various opinions, and they're all kind of almost, I think, I would say inconsequential. It doesn't really change the outcome of the text, but it's really what it's really trying to state is that the essence of the book of Job isn't really in its details. And you get into people like Maimonides and his commentating when he's talking about Job, he's saying like, okay, all you have to do is like take out the big theme. Everything else that's written there is just kind of to support it. So like when you're reading one of the dialogues, you just need like 2 sentences out of it. Everything else before and after, it's just trying to beef up those 2 concepts, and that's its idea. So there's like that idea, like that's like the whole structure of it. But then there's also maybe a more real concept that like this is playing onto a true human experience or a true human emotion, but it's just painted into such a maybe a fantastical degree. But just to give you the context about what they were talking about. This is a tractate Bava Batra. think 14. One second. Let's find the page. 15A, side A. The pages are side A and side B. So this is page 15, side A, the first side. This is the only affirmative statement of who authored the Book of Job. Possibility. This is the only opinion that's ever given. It says Moses wrote his books. So it's saying these are the books that Moses wrote. He wrote his book, which is the Book of Deuteronomy. The passages of Bilam, which is the sections of the Torah, in like Leviticus, where the Israelites go to war with the king of Balak and the prophet Bilam, and Bilam has a donkey. They're saying those parts were written by Moses. So Moses wrote Deuteronomy, and he wrote the sections of the Torah that pertain to the war with Balaam and the sorcerer Bilam and the prophet Bilam. So it says Moses wrote his book, Deuteronomy, the passages of Bilam, and the Book of Job. That's the statement that is made. So what then becomes interesting is that it's not really necessarily reflective of stating that a historical figure of Moses penned Job, but what the Talmud's more reflective of is saying that there's something about Job that is, I guess you could say, indicative of only Moses could have authored this book. Moses, again, being the master prophet teacher, saying that there's, and what it lists essentially two books. It says he did Deuteronomy and the parts about Bilam, but those are all in the Torah. So it's saying that Moses' canon was the Torah and the book and Job. This is what Moses gave to the people. Maybe it's not saying it historically, but it's saying like Moses' hand had to have done this, or like that's the rationale it's given. That's one of. And so what is further said to clarify it is that it goes on to talk about, okay, so this is when Job possibly lived, and why is like this word used for where his land. So like it says he's from the land of Uts, and Uts isn't like a word, so it's a location, but like there's no place called Uts. It just appears in the book of Job. It's like, what does that mean? So maybe it's not a place. What does Uts mean? So like it runs through this kind of breaking down of what is conceptually, what is Uts, where is Job from conceptually. And a lot of times it relates to trees, but that's something else. But it wraps up and it ends with this. It says, and the other side of the scholars, so there's a discussion. It says one side was saying this, and it says the other side of the scholars were participating in a study session before Rav Shmuel bar Nehemiah, who was the leader of the court in his generation. And he said, Job never lived, he never was created, rather Job, it is merely a parable. So that's pretty much how this section of Talmud wraps up. It's talking about Job. So what's fundamentally, I think, really interesting, though, is the idea of it's entertaining the concept that like we're never monolithic, obviously, in our understanding of interpretation of scripture, and that's what it brings down. It's giving all these opinions and all these kind of contradictory opinions and going back and forth about what the possible meanings, but it's still rooted in the fact that it's structured as a parable or a metaphor for something greater than what is clearly written in the black and white text. So if it's written in the black and white text of a guy going through suffering and trying to get answers, but if you read the text and he doesn't get any answers, because that's not the point, like there's no rationale through it, because the idea is like you're not going to get a rationale. So it's talking about what you can do and experience, because nobody's going to get encounters with God. That just doesn't happen, right? And so when the text writes it, even when he does get it, he doesn't get any answers. So it's trying to remove that concept from the viewer. So if you're reading the book trying to find answers, and the book's blatantly saying it's not going to give you answers, you might see there might be issues that way. But what I think is interesting and what the Talmud brings about is that saying that the possibility that Moses authored the book of Job is essentially saying that there's something that Moses either had to give the people like a concept that was kind of void in the law, something that he thought was necessary. And it's also maybe appropriate to see it as only Moses himself could have authored it. And so you could get into the idea of like, why would it have been Moses? And actually there's a lecture on YouTube. By Dr. Zornberg. It's called Black Sun, Moses and Job. So it's like, I think if you just type in Black Sun, Moses and Job in YouTube, it'll come up. It's like an hour and a half. And basically what she does is her whole focus is like, based off the statement in the Talmud of Moses author Job, she's like trying to understand like, well, okay, what is it about Moses that we know of, and what do we know about the book of Job? And then essentially, why would it be Moses that was chosen? Not necessarily taking the viewpoint of historically Moses authored it, but like, what is it about the book of Job that reveals a concept that only Moses could give out of it? And it's pretty much related to the concept of cruelty. It's both the Torah and the book of Job reflect deep concepts of the understanding of cruelty and how God's cruelty reflects the world, always maybe as an act of justice, masked in cruelty, but also just things work out that way as well. So a non-rationale. And it's something about Moses had such a clear understanding of God, since the ending of the book of Deuteronomy says that Moses was a unique prophet who behold God's image. So he had like so what's classically understood, that he had a clear understanding of who God was, and what at least what Dr. I forget her name, sorry, Dr. Zornberg is presenting is that what Moses knew, which he could reflect in Job, is that he knew the cruelty of God and what the cruelty of God represented, as it not being necessarily something evil, it just existed. And how does one relate to that? And if one has an open, loving relationship with God, that's like very deep. Like it's the opening of Job. It says that there's a man in the land of Uz. His name was Job. This man was Tam, like fullness, complete, content, and upright. And he feared God, and he despised evil. So it's even like maybe painting a man of the highest caliber, and what is reflected maybe in Moses is that he had this kind of relationship where he was maybe seen as being worthy to have a deeper understanding of God's presence, and he seemed to deem fit to that be transferred into the book of Job. So anyways, good lecture. I'd suggest people watch it if you're just interested in that concept. But what's I think what's an interesting concept that I would like your opinion on is that if it is reading of a, let's say, let's pair like my approach with that approach. Let's say we have Moses, regardless of, let's see, the character of Moses, having the character of Moses penning the book of Job. And now I'll argue that purpose is to, so I should say my opinion on how I interpret the book of Job, I don't think it's the original intent of the authors. I don't think they actually viewed it as a kind of like a psychological dialogue within themselves. I don't think it was that concept, but I think it was definitely related to it. But let's say you have a trying to get across a specific message, and that specific message, whether it be actually in fact about why bad things happen to good people, why it is about the problem of evil, or why it is, maybe it's just talking about, like I argue, the commentary on the ultimate, maybe use the term destruction of ego, but elevation of self outside factors. Like, so Job loses everything, but he's not really fazed by it, and he's goes into a contemplative state. He doesn't really break down, and it's presented that way because it's kind of externalized. But if it's all happening internally, then you have like all these representations of his life are vanished. And what's really interesting is that his wife pops up for like one scene, and she's like, she just badmouths him. She like tells him to pretty much kill himself, it's like just blaspheme and die, like get it over with. And so like what that could be representative is like, and like, but she only pops up for like a sentence. So it's like even that's an aspect of the psyche that like pops up for a second, just like you're worthless, like you're scum, but like it goes away immediately. That's kind of showing the process. She like pops up and then she flakes away. Then he has this conversation with his friends. Then the third character comes in, and then he's finally with God. And everything's restituted again. But if it's written by a purpose, and the vast majority of the book is about this kind of going through stages and rationalizations, what do you think? I guess the message that author or authors would be trying to get across on like maybe just a basic psychological level, which is what I'm most interested in. Like, what do you think would be like the simplest understanding of how one could benefit from the Book of Job? Nothing outside of something so specific as, you know, something bad happened to me, I want to figure out why, but like what could be like its like root core of like just why people would gravitate to it, and what might be the intent behind its structure and its composition. Sorry.
Well, I mean, you raise good questions, and I think that there's obviously some importance with it, because it's something that, like I said, it either is something that people wrestle with and they read it and they have a hard time with it, or it's something that I think, or people study it. Or I was going to ask you if you had looked at any of the Christian or Islamic understandings of the character Job or the Book of Job, because you know, I don't really see it being studied quite as frequently outside of very specific scholars, at least, and I'm speaking in terms of people with a Christian or a Muslim background. So it's almost like it's either utterly ignored, it scares people when they read it, so they want to like drop it like a hot potato, if you will, or some people actually try to have an understanding of it. You know, and so I think certainly it must be commenting on something psychological, because there's one thing for certain, is that it won't go away. You know, I mean, it's a part of the Hebrew scriptures that I see the most. Well, maybe like the Song of Solomon might be another book where I see a lot of people kind of going back and forth on what's the deal with this. But I think certainly the Book of Job, because of the nature of the text and the narrative and the implications, certainly causes a lot of people to have an opinion about it, even if it's an opinion like, well, I can't understand it. But I think it's difficult for people, based on what I've heard you say and some of the readings that I've done myself, it's difficult for people to read a text like this and say, well, this is commenting on the human condition and how we understand suffering. And when we're faced with suffering, what are some of the stages of grief or anger or just, you know, again, you know, how do we deal with these situations? And I think it's easier for people to ignore or not to consider the very human element of the story, and instead say, oh, well, this is a running commentary on how God's a jerk to Job and does not give him a satisfactory explanation for what happened. And interesting enough, you know, the book that I have here with me, and I would not be able to summarize it very well because it's such a complicated book, but I have Jung's book, and the irony is you keep saying there's no answer, and his title of his book is called The Answer to Job. So, you know, so it's like he tries to have an explanation for what happened, but then he of course drags in a bunch of, I mean, he talks about the New Testament and the Book of Revelation. I mean, he goes beyond the Jewish scripture, because that's just how Jung was when he wrote this particular book. But yeah, I think there's something to it, and I think what's more important, at least in my opinion, is to try and understand it psychologically, because it seems to me that if we're going to try and apply a metaphysical interpretation to it, we're going to run into some brick walls. I mean, the story just doesn't seem to give us as you said, a solid answer. So to try to even milk a metaphysical explanation out of it almost seems like you're heading in the wrong direction. But yet, many people I have read and seen, that is what they focus on, is the metaphysics. Oh, God's a terrible being because look what he did to Job. Poor Job, right? And I'm wondering if it's scary for some people to contemplate the psychological importance to it. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I kind of find it ironic because it's usually coming from the same kind of people that will have no issues with saying that some tragedies are just chance events. But it's the same argument. Like, that's what Job's trying to make. It's painting a picture to best describe a scenario. It's not a theological statement of how God operates. It's not a historical account of how, but it's stating a parameter that complete randomness. It builds up Job and it says how great he is, and then it rectifies at the end to say, like, because he's so great. But the point was that it's completely random. That's the whole point of it. That's why it's kind of coined as a test, because like otherwise, like what purpose would it have served? So it's essentially the same argument. It's saying that random things happen in the world that aren't justified, and how does one work through it? And it's interesting to me, like, for somebody to make that argument, it's usually they usually have the same kind of worldview. They just don't want to attach that there might be a possible religious tradition that says the same thing, or a possible spiritual tradition that says the same thing. They're saying that random things happen in the world, and therefore there is no God. Whereas the book of Job is saying random things happen in the world because God exists, kind of idea. It's answering the same question. It's just not satisfactory. So I think when people run away from it, it's because they have maybe a particular view and caricature of who God is. And that's why I think the book of Job is so interesting, because it's clearly written in a very archaic understanding of the nature of God and the essence of God. Like, this isn't the high refined monotheism of the Babylonian exile and Persian. This isn't the monotheism of the book of Isaiah. This isn't the monotheism of the book of Zechariah. This isn't like this beautifully penned and orchestrated, almost poetic back and forth like you have in the book of Jeremiah and stuff like that, where you have a very clear understanding of one purely transcendent and in control deity who is completely personal, yet at the same time is completely unknowable. What you have in the book of Job is that stuff takes a backseat, and it's only used as the monotheism is but it's to state also that nothing is necessarily in and of itself with purpose. So that's another thing. But I think what's interesting about seeing the book of Job as like ignoring the I guess explanation of God and why people might, or rationality of God and why people might fear that, I think is related into it's a very archaic book. Like, I think, like I commented before, like, it's beautifully written. It's like in the Hebrew, it's like the most poetic book of the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. But I think that's the reason why, because it's structured in such a weird and archaic and ancient diatribe that's not found in the rest of the book of the Bibles. I mean, Ecclesiastes is also interesting in its poetic styling, and it's trying to rationality through life, kind of, but not like the book of Job. But I think it's because it's reflective of a very ancient and very almost primitive way of looking at the world. I think that's also maybe why one opinion is that it's given to Moses, because Moses, like, being the one that saint that penned the Torah, the first book of the Jews, the theology is brand new. So it's trying to maybe connect the idea of like this being a very archaic book, and it's also a lot of times, a lot of opinions, they're dating Job as being a pre Moses figure, a pre-Abraham figure, like a very archaic thing. And it's also reflective of how they viewed the heavenly realm. You had one God, chief God, and kind of like the court system of, in this case, his judges or his prosecutors, whatever they might be, being his court, like his heavenly court, and then he's kind of like interacting with the world in this kind of very kind of, I don't want to use the word archaic, but a very ancient way of the way humanity used to look at the deities. So it's still painted as a monotheistic idea, but it's clearly kind of within the realm of an understanding that there's kind of like the one God manifests his attributes through a variety of different ways. So this is, which is a very different way of looking at God than even found in the Torah. So it could be argued that Job, like the structure of Job, was just taken from an earlier myth or an earlier tradition, and it was kind of Judaized, if you will, or monotheized, with just to tackle a specific issue again, because it's a parable, and that's how you might want to view it. But like I think another example is, like I said, one of his friends' name is Bildad, and that's the name of an Akkadian deity. So it's, you don't get many Akkadian deity names in the Hebrew Bible, because the Akkadians were long gone, kind of idea, by the time when the main events of the Hebrew Bible take place. So it also like harkens to like maybe an older tradition. But just to connect this idea of the archaicness in being related to why people would be afraid of it, because it's not giving you the fleshed out, complex, almost philosophical understanding that we know of a monotheistic God. You're getting this very early primitive one that's very almost hands-offish, but still in control and not really comforting in any way. Just sets things in order and is in control and is judging things and is like, oh, never really comforts Job like you do have in later prophets. You don't have an intimate relationship like you have with Moses and God, where they're talking in a friendship way. So like why I think that's interesting, and it harkens to maybe a very archaic view, and why people might be uncomfortable with that, because that's not the traditional concept of God that we're used to or enjoy in the West. A God that gives you answers, and a God that's closer and not very distant, even if you're talking about a very purely monotheistic, still a God that communicates with prophets and hears your prayers. That's not the God painted in Job. And so I think that caters to, it's just a very archaic and old text, whether it's the text we have now, but it's at least written in it's from an archaic and old style. And I think that reflects back into language. This is just commentary on the book of Job. Just one paragraph from the introduction. It says, the language of this work, the book of Job, is also unique. It consists of most ancient form of Hebrew known to use and is known to use totally unlike the Hebrew of scriptural. So it's like it's very almost primitive in its reflection towards, like I said, like the book of Isaiah, or even books like Joshua or Proverbs or something like that. It's very a little bit more simpler, and which is also why it's considered to be such high poetry, I guess. So it says, so it's saying, unlike Hebrew of the Bible, the Mishnah, Rabbinic Hebrew, and certainly not modern Hebrew, it is often dense and difficult to fathom, replete with the most concise yet often obscure grammatical constructions. The Masoretic text, which is the standard text that all people that utilize the Hebrew Bible adhere to, except for Samaritans. So besides the Samaritans, any other faith tradition that relies on the Hebrew Bible in some way, they follow the Masoretic text. So it says the Masoretic text, or the official Bible, itself contains an unprecedented 110 words that appear nowhere else in the entirety of the Bible. No other book of the Bible contains as many such words. The vocabulary employed by the author is also one of the largest. It is, if not the largest, of any of the ancient Hebrew writers. And so what you have is not only this kind of very simplistic and ancient text, but it's the language is written in is structured in a way that it renders for beautiful poetry. So it puts like a completely different spin on the text. So if you now are reading the text not as kind of like a Dante's Inferno, like somebody writing down like kind of like a theological polemic within this frame of narrative, but if you see it as a giant poem, then the mentality of like what the implications of the text might be will be completely different than if you're reading it as simply a guide to suffering in the world. But now if it's a very multi-layered constructed poetry, because the language evolves throughout the text from the beginning to the end, it kind of crescendos. The stylization of the languages hits like a nice plateau, and especially when you're getting into the back and forth between God and Job, and also with the introduction of Elihu, the last character. It's that the language changes to a much I don't know, maybe more like a playful style. So if that's also the intent involved, I think it adds another layer to why the text of Job might be seen as unapproachable to some people. Because if it was written to be a work of poetry, maybe to a very extremely deep theological poem reflecting on the deepest, most darkest aspects of the human condition, but it's still written in the poem and you're not reading it in that sense, maybe there might be something lost that originally was there that would turn people off because it's not giving its full exposure. That's also, I think, one way of looking at that, I think, gets lost in translation, so to speak.
Well, thank you for that. I guess one thing, a question that I have, and by asking you this, I may be breaking the subtle rule that we've set up so far, which is not trying to look at or get stuck in the metaphysical implications, but looking at the psychological. So, having said that, the question I have is, earlier in our discussion, you said you talked about the cruelty of God. And you said that a couple times, and I just want to ask you what you mean by that, because I could expect that people either watching this now or when it's archived on my channel and will be watching it then, they may hear you say that. You said it a couple times, and they might go, cruelty of God. Well, what does that mean? So I'm wondering if you can explain what that might mean when you say cruelty of God.
Right. So I think I got to figure out how to word this in the proper way, but I think it's I guess it's reflective of the maybe you could use the term extreme monotheism that's part of the Jewish tradition, in the sense that we don't entertain any, we don't begin to fathom to entertain any concept of dualism, so any flirtation with it. And I'm not speaking monolithically. This is my own personal opinion. I think when you have something like in Islam or in Christianity, the introduction of the Satan or the devil figure, I'm not saying Christians or Muslims or Zoroastrians. They don't believe, like, obviously I understand the distinction between the hierarchy of power, but I'm saying, like, if we don't have an idea where we can pawn off certain concepts that might be hard for us to accept as being what we would like to be true. So, not to say that these other faiths use Satan as a scapegoat, but if you have an idea saying, like, well, the world isn't correct and this is why, and you have a entity that can be representative of that, that's very different than not having that. So where a Jew comes in, and this is like straight, I will just bring up the sources quickly so I remember. And this is, so when a Jew comes to have to grapple with concepts of like this is a perfect example, like the book of Job, about the concept of evil or why God lets bad things happen, we can't say that, well, it's not that God wants it to, but it's because of an outside force, or it's because of something that is at this point in time not in the will or the accordance of God. So the implications of that means something pretty blatant that I'll just bring up one source, for example. The prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah 45:7, it says, this is God speaking to the prophet. The context is kind of irrelevant. This is more of a statement. The chapters like 40 through to maybe 54 really highlight concepts about God. That's Isaiah's monotheism. But he says, I form light and I create darkness. This is God speaking. I make prosperity and create despair. I, God, do all those things. And the word for despair is actually evil. It's also echoed, also in the book of Jeremiah at a certain point, where God says he also creates evil. But why it's harkens back to the Talmud's opinion about maybe it's written by Moses, because Moses, at least as it's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's in chapter 30, I don't remember the verse, but it goes something like God speaking to the people through Moses saying, I set before you today, and he's saying like the covenant, the law, the relationship between man and God through the Torah. He's saying, I set before you today life and good, death and evil. Choose life. And that's what we would say is the first theological statement, that God is in absolute control of all aspects. He's saying that he's setting before you, even if it's symbolically, he's saying life and good, death and evil, saying that he's presenting to, meaning that in his possession that he's handing towards these people. And this is the model of free will kind of idea. Like he's saying you have a choice between, and then he's encouraging you to choose life, choose to do the good thing, don't choose the death and evil. But he's also presenting you with that. And like in Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're pretty explicit, saying, I God create good and I create evil. So when we have that understanding about God, then we also have to understand that certain reflective attitudes of how God operates can be interpreted what we might say as being cruel. And so again, bringing it back to Moses, why you might get this from Moses more than any other person is because within the book of Genesis, you have the expulsion from the garden, you have the flood, you have the Tower of Babel, you have Sodom and Gomorrah, you have the destruction of Egypt, you have the massacres in the wilderness, you have the 40 years in the wilderness, you have the death of entire generation in the wilderness, you have the death of Moses. So things that might be interpreted as cruel acts, as very harsh, unrepentant acts of God, is what's wrestled with. And again, I would probably just defer people to that lecture on YouTube, Black Sun, Moses and Job. She can kind of clarify that position about what that might entail. But for why I would say it's about cruelty is that's from a human perspective of how we would obviously say that. We could, why me from the Jewish perspective wouldn't say that God is cruel isn't so much that it's, well, God's loving and God's kind, is that we're very strict in our monotheism to the degree that we don't believe that God has any attributes. So this is backed in, I'll get the verse later, but it's backed in the book of Deuteronomy also, where it's we are commanded to walk in God's ways and to be essentially perfect. That's a commandment, to walk in God's ways. So the idea is like, how do we know how to walk in God's ways? Well, you emulate God. So the idea is how God is written about through at least the Torah. We can also get into the rest of the Bible, but the Torah is the most important aspect of theology. So how God's written about in the Torah isn't reflective of who God is, but who people are supposed to be. So the Torah says that God is just, slow to mercy, abundant in loving kindness. So that's not reflective of who the creator of space-time is. We don't actually believe that God is loving or just or merciful or even cruel or even full of justice. We believe that, or at least I should say, the tradition teaches that just as God is just, we are to be just. Just as God is merciful, we are to be merciful. So our monotheism doesn't allow us to describe God in terms that he would have been the archetype of to begin with. So we don't believe that God is just because we don't believe he can be dictated by the definition of justice, because he created it. It's kind of like how I think you might be familiar, like the kind of the Muslim Christian apologetics about God can't enter creation kind of idea. That's like a very classical debate between the two friends. It's kind of the same way looking at it, but we're using in abstract terms. Like God cannot be loving. That's not something God could do. God cannot have that relationship. So the way we relate to God is that we are trying to be God-like, and we relate to how God is represented in, for instance, the Torah as who we are supposed to be. That is our imperative, and I'll get you the verse soon. But so when we have this view of God, that God is truly undefinable, even when he is defined, it's more about the definition of who people are to be, even though we have maybe basic views of God, like God is one. So what we then have is reflected of human nature is possibly how God's viewed. So when I do say that God is cruel, it is a kind of double-edged sword in the sense that I am saying that we believe that God is in control of all aspects, and there's no force necessarily dictating any things. And how that theology is interpreted is a completely different story, to the degree of like the literalism of God's interaction in the world. But it is seen that God is in complete autonomy and authority. So any aspect of things that might be seen as evil or cruel or unjust would have to be coming from God. It couldn't be coming from anywhere else. It's just that idea cannot be entertained. It's not allowed. And it's affirmed a few times in our scriptures that like it's really a rejection of dualism in the truest sense, like that we're embracing that evil, the bad things God is in control of and creating. And that's pretty much what the book of Job is also trying to say, right? That's also one image that it's painting of God. But it's also reflected of the fact that God, when I say God is cruel, it's, again, God cannot be truly defined. That's also in the realm of it. So do I believe that the supreme deity, the architect, if you will, of space-time and creation and humanity and all that jazz, do I believe that that is cruel? No. What I do believe is that humans can see the deity interact in cruel ways, and that is just human nature. And that is like, yeah, it's just purely human nature. That is how we perceive the deity. And since that's how we perceive God, it's still telling of the nature of what God is. And the nature of God is if it is in complete control, then that means that things like unjust suffering is still for somehow being justified in a certain way. So we would still hesitate to go that far, because then that is saying that God is operating in a certain kind of paradigm of justice, cruelty, right or wrong when he authors those things. So he doesn't really work in those paradigms. So when I say God is cruel, I'm saying more so that I accept a deity in which the supremacy of that deity is that things are happening because he controls it, and I have to understand why those things are happening, and I interpret those things as some of those things being cruel, or being unjust, but I won't relinquish control of those things. So that's one way of saying it. But again, the underlying pin is that I don't believe that God is definable in those kinds of terms to begin with. So it's not really reflective of what I believe a God is, but it is reflective, I guess, the human condition. It's really, really, I guess, reflected of my view of the Book of Job.
Well, I appreciate you answering that question. I mean, it sounds like to me, I can relate to many of the things that you said in your explanation. I do think that at the end of the day, God is so beyond our understanding that pretty much Scripture is our attempt, and this is just my opinion, our attempt to scratch the surface. You know, it's really trying to understand the divine and how the divine interacts with us and our condition, thinking that our consciousness keeps evolving and has evolved since time immemorial, that the more we evolve, the more our understanding of God evolves, and the language we use, and when we're really contemplating the connection between this material world and the divine, you know, that might change. But yet, no matter what we do, we're lucky if we get any sort of glimpse of it at all, because it's so beyond us. That's at least my take on it. But you know, so I guess, you know, when I remember when I first read, you know, Isaiah chapter 45 verse 7, I remember at first being kind of weirded out by it, to say, and I'm using the Stone Hebrew Bible edition here, the translation that I'm about to read out loud. I am the one who forms light and creates darkness, who makes peace and creates evil. I am Hashem, maker of all these. And I remember when I first read that thinking, well, I don't know how okay I am with thinking that God creates evil. But I've also contemplated what you said, where classically, and I would even say metaphysically speaking, many Christians and Muslims will scapegoat evil onto this figure of Satan. And I think that it's a fascinating exercise to think that, well, instead of scapegoating and just saying that, look, good and bad happens in our reality, and God is ultimately responsible for our reality, that I don't know if I could say that God literally has evil things happen, but because he is the author of reality, evil things do occur. I don't know if that makes much sense, and I don't know if that's how you might think about that, but that's sort of my takeaway from it, at least.
Yeah, it's definitely valid. I think it's definitely a rational opinion. It's I think my personal opinion on the matter would be like in the sense that I think maybe we're just caught. I think more so we're caught up in the term evil, because I think that the term evil has a much broader implication than its plain definition. So I think when it gets the term evil, then it would be necessarily how the author is writing in the Bible. I think for us, evil also brings up kind of maybe a little bit more fantastic and a lot more sinister than just being the opposite of order or the opposite of good necessarily. So like when like, for instance, like I could think for me, like when I think of evil, maybe like a gut reaction I might think of is like a rapist, whereas I don't think that's the evil that is being painted in. It's not that kind of evil. It's pretty much saying it's just it's the opposite of purpose or order in a way. So it's kind of like God. It's saying that God put these mechanics in the world, structures in the world to operate, and when those structures happen to be order or disorder, you know, goodness and evil, and to say that God creates those things isn't is the same thing to say that, you know, like God is definitely don't believe. We definitely don't believe in a the Jewish tradition doesn't believe in a concept of, or at least just say my Jewish tradition doesn't believe in a concept of, what do you call it? Predestination. So to say that God has kind of authored, let's say, a woman getting raped wouldn't really fit into my definition of saying that God creates evil. It'd be more so the idea that God creates the parameters and implications for things to happen in our world around us, and when those things we would interpret as, free will decisions of morality, justice, even something maybe as more simple as our ability to kind of make personal calculated decisions about our future, something like that per se. So I think it's more so people get hung up on how we view the term evil, whereas I think the author is more trying to say that there isn't something that God's not in control of, and all parameters are there for a reason. It's not just like some random freak occurrence that there's evil in the world. Like there's reason and pattern for this, but that's not to say there's a justification for like saying like God authors like in his like grand book of the course of human history every single genocide and mass murder. I think the Bible clearly tries to at least paint a picture of working towards a understanding of a personal I guess elevation compared to necessarily a explanation of God, Hashem itself. Yeah, I don't know if that's on the same trajectory, but
well, I certainly would agree. I mean, as a Swedenborgian, we don't believe in predestination either. So it is sort of like this. Of course, from our perspective, we would say that the essence of God is divine love and wisdom, and that the idea is that if we open ourselves up to being led in a selfless life, we'll end up in a that's one way of living. Or if you want to live a selfish, narrow, very egocentric life, then that's for lack of a better word, that's evil. I could see the book of Isaiah in that verse, and also coming back to Job as potentially articulating that position, maybe. However, I'm hesitant to do that in this discussion because, again, I feel like that's like my theology potentially projecting onto Hebrew scripture, and I really would like to have an understanding of the Jewish perspective on this text, which I mean you have articulated. So I do find it fascinating. It's just from my own understanding, I think after I contemplated, especially Isaiah 45, I suddenly, when I thought about the text and what the text might be saying, the text doesn't bother me anymore. Whereas when I first read it, and I see the text you just posted. When I first read the text, I was kind of uncomfortable, but now it doesn't really bother me anymore. So the text you've posted, Deuteronomy 3:16, in that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways. Yeah. So, I guess harmonizing that verse, I don't know if you want to comment on that verse from Deuteronomy or not.
Yeah, it's just kind of like our backing up of our understanding as to if God is undescribable, why is he described? And it's because we are commanded to be like God, to walk in his ways. And it's also stated also again, I think before in Deuteronomy 10. I can just find it in Deuteronomy 12. It says, And what does the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord your God, and to walk in his ways, to love him, to serve the God with all your heart and with all your soul. So it's saying that the concept of service of God, with like your heart, your soul, and through love and through fear is related to emulation and walking in his ways. So that's what we predicate our stance that the terms that are used to describe God throughout Scripture are more so reflective of the ideal human state than it is really in any way describing God whatsoever. And we would only really, I keep saying we, I mean like my own tradition at least, we would keep maintaining that maybe like things such as, you know, like the oneness of God is an affirmative statement about God, or the fact that it says that, like we stated, God creates good and creates evil, or he says, I put before you, you know, options like they don't describe who God is or what God is necessarily. It more so describes what God is not. Um, and so when we get into parts of the Bible, specifically, I'd say specifically even in the book of Genesis, um, we are to, at least according to a traditional Jewish perspective, based off of this verse in Deuteronomy 30 as well in Deuteronomy 10, is that the essence of what we know about God isn't so much about who God is, but who we should be. And we are made in the image of God. That's the whole connection between that we get between God is becoming better and greater people. One of the another commandment says, "Justice, justice shall you pursue," and it's related to this concept of emulating God's ways in order to elevate yourself. So when we have a view of God that is almost really removed of definition, then we start reading the text differently, and we start reading. You might start reading one's relationship to God differently, and I think this I specifically bring this up with Job, but because to think that the book of Job is anyway trying to write a theology on how God operates is, I think, disingenuous. That's my whole. I'd say there's no monolithic stance on how scriptural interpretation, like it doesn't matter, like it's completely irrelevant. But I do think it's problematic to read Job in a sense of, like you're saying, the metaphysical, trying to define like the heavenly realms and the logic behind justice, because I don't think it's written that way. And the way God is written about is so alien and so foreign to the way the Torah is written, or like bringing up Isaiah. It's to teach that there's no substance to the character of God, because classically how we relate to God is viewing God and emulated him, but there's nothing to emulate in the God of Job. The God of Job is a character piece. It is I would use the term, it is a narrative device to predicate, you know, the realms of the story being able to get the message it can across. It's not reflective of Hashem, the name of the God of the Bible of itself. So that I think is kind of dictates how I might interpret the book of Job. When I see God and I relate to God through reflective acts, when I can walk in his ways, as literal terms, right? When I can follow his path, that's when I see the God I relate to. So when I go to the book of Job, that God's not there. So then I don't come to the book as being teaching me anything theological about how the world works, but it's what it might teach me about how humans work. And that's why, like I quoted from the Talmud, that Job never existed. No, Job never was, and he never existed. All of this was written for a parable. So it's saying it was written for a purpose, and that purpose behind it must have been the topic you brought up must have been from a psychological aspect, but I also relate because it must have been written for that aspect. Because if it's not written in the realm of teaching any necessary theology, and if it's teaching and it's maybe trying to emphasize that, and that's why it paints a God that's so distant and so not part of the picture at all, and just kind of very abstract, a lesson where it's more about the human psychology and the human spiritual or theological experience. The Book of Job just comes off differently. And so I think when you brought up, like, if I read maybe the more Christian or Islamic standpoints, um, definitely definitely do. Maybe I would say more so from a more so maybe for a Protestant and to a lesser degree Orthodox stance on Job, and Islam purely through like a Sunni stance. But what's interesting is that, like, for instance, when a Christian, and I'm just using the broad term for when I say Christian, I'll say like American Protestants, kind of evangelical Protestants, Christianity, majority of lectures that I hear about Job on. Since it's coming from that perspective, what is interesting and different from me is that the aspect of original sin ends up playing a role into it. They're saying like there is almost like a justification for the suffering, that even though you live a righteous life, even though you do all you can do, the fact that you have original sin still means that you're damned by God and stuff. And like no matter how righteous Job was, so that plays into it. That's like really interesting, I think, to me. A very different way of looking at it, and also the idea of sin and evil are seen as in a very different light than in my tradition, as being almost like cancerous kind of like infections that can't get rid of and take laborious effort to maintain. Whereas in my tradition, sin is more of a choice, so it's emphasized differently in the books. And I haven't looked too much in the Islamic perspective. I know the story. I know the story in the Qur'an. I've read it a few times with commentaries. But I haven't gone into any deep breakdowns or any analyzing it. But I think what's very interesting is that out of maybe the three traditions, what I know so far is out of the Islamic one, it takes such a much more, I think, overtly symbolic meaning. Like it puts so much more details in like Iblis, and it puts so much more details in like demons, and it puts so much more details of like a real kind of power struggle between forces of good and the forces of evil. It's a lot more. I think there's a lot more passion in a way. It's a lot more. I think it's a lot more spiritual of a reading of the text than I would say. I think my personal opinion is that the Jewish reading of the text, I think, is a very psychological and maybe psychosomatic reading of the text. You want to take it that far, I don't know, but you could go that way. I think how the Quran renders it, I view it as very much as and I don't know too much about Quranic literature, and I'm definitely not well read in Quranic scholarship, but I see it as a lot more of a not spiritual, but a much more mythic and a much more almost symbolic of a text. Whereas I think the symbolism in the Jewish tradition is more about the human condition, whereas I think the symbolism in the Quranic tradition seems to be more about the symbolism of the struggle between good and evil, and between righteousness and maybe the material world and the spiritual world. Like I see it a lot more. And the Christian reading, I see it, again, I don't want to paint a big brush. I know the Orthodox, I think, my opinion, at least I've heard one Romanian Orthodox bishop and an Antiochian Orthodox priest gave two talks where they hinted on Job. And what the consensus was very interesting, is that the view of Job is a story of the every person. Not so much in the metaphors that maybe Jews would take it as it being like a complete parable, but they really see it reflected of the human experience throughout life. And it's just kind of like maybe the author has kind of maybe emphasized it to get their points across. But they really see the human condition, and obviously that's reflected, they would say, of the passion and the mysteries of Christ, the notions of suffering and evil and redemption and faithfulness in God. Like they see that oozing out of the Book of Job. So I think throughout all these traditions, they're really not seeing the same story, because I think obviously everybody's coming with their own baggage, but I think it's unique in the sense that the takes that are being had do lend to, at the core of the Book of Job, isn't trying to teach a moral lesson or isn't trying to teach a theological lesson, but it is trying to, in some way, comment on the rationality of certain things that happen to people throughout your life. In some way, I think all traditions do hint on that. Whereas, again, I would say, like, at least from what I'm experienced with the Sunni Quranic tradition, that seems to be more about the struggle between good and evil in a spiritual sense, a conflict. With Christians, it's more about, the redemptive action of faith. Just, I don't know, that's how I see it comes across from them. And I would say my particular view through Torah-based Jewish perspective is it's the commentary and guide of how to overcome certain obstacles of life, especially with the realization that you have no control over these things. So you can't dwell on them and you can't loathe in them. And that's really comes across over and over in the Book of Job. And you can't, because you're not going to get answers for them. What you can do is evolve through them and utilize those experiences to change to higher states. And that's also maybe argued why at the end of the Book of Job, it's painted, kind of tacked on that his life was even better than it was before. Like, it's kind of argued how could have, like, he went through sort of psychological drama, but it's kind of trying to emphasize it more, trying to say, like, the evolution can come through tragedy. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see those different perspectives. Again, those are broad overviews, but I think that's how I definitely, what comes out at me when I look into the same ideas, the same core stories and beliefs, but from completely different faith traditions.
Well, I want to thank you for tackling that my question regarding the other two traditions, Christianity and Islam's view of the story. If anything, this discussion has really inspired me to potentially do a follow-up video of my own, at least maybe summarizing Jung's perspective, as he does talk about at least the Christian point of view. I don't really know of any key scholar from Islam that really focused on the Book of Job, or excuse me, the prophet Job, as he would be described in the Qur'an. But maybe I'll do a little research and come back to that question. I think that'd be interesting to do a comparative piece from these three different traditions and their perspective on the subject. But with the 2 minutes that we have left, I just wanted to, at this point, thank you again, Path, for coming on the show and for doing this topic and enlightening the viewers and listeners on this particular subject. I think it's fascinating. I think it's something that, not many people know about, and certainly it's inspiring for me to do more research on the subject. So I want to thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Could talk about Job all day in different aspects, so it was great, and it was, I also definitely learned a lot from you and really fleshed out some ideas. And I guess I would just say everybody should pick up the Book of Job and give it a read. Give it a try. See what they get out of it.
For sure. Well, we look forward to seeing your book in the future, even if it does take you 4 years to write it. I'll certainly be wanting to buy a copy once it's out. And just for the viewers to know that the next podcast is scheduled to be, this will be episode 7. It'll be the 12th of September. That's a Saturday at 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I don't have a guest or topic locked in yet. It could either be Klingshore again to do a third part about Matsky and the Hadiths, the Islamic traditions and their authenticity, and the studying and the criticism of that subject. It could be I have had a suggestion to have a particular Sufi Muslim on the show to discuss Sufism in detail, the mystical tradition of Islam. And also, of course, if Wayman 29 is available to discuss something about the Bible or history, I'm sure. But that's what's scheduled for the 12th, is a topic which we will see in due time which topic I decide to go with. But certainly, Path, I would love to have you, of course, back on the show again to discuss further topics. I feel like every time I talk to you, I always learn something that I knew nothing prior. So I would love to have you on again. So yeah, I'm sure we can figure something out, a good date and time and a topic for that. So yeah, I want to thank you again for being on the show, and I'll make sure to link that lecture that you posted, and also I'll link your channel as well, so that people who have an interest can check out your material and that lecture that you mentioned. And yeah, so I guess that's the end of the show for today. Thank you all for watching, and peace be with you all.